On one side, those who follow the communists, and on the other side, we have those who did not accept the communist rule, and among themselves, there was many other groups which, for different reasons, have some sort of special ideas about how to build up the country in the future. I, by then, as a young student, belonged to a group of Vietnamese Nationalist Party called the Diet Party. As a member of the Nationalist Party, I tried my best, even by the time when there is the beginning of the fight against the French for the independence of Vietnam. We were in a somewhat very awkward position. On one side, all of us want to participate in the fight against the French for the independence of the country. But taking into account the very strict control of the communist regime, we knew by then that sooner or later the communists would try to destroy us. Fortunately, by then appeared the solution that all of us by then called the Bui Diem solution. Bui Diem was the former emperor of Vietnam. He leaves his throne. He became a counselor for the communist regime, but after a short period of time, he went to China. And from there, he was contacted by the French, and the French proposed for the return of Bui Diem for a regime that is completely on the other side of the communist regime. Through negotiation with the French, Bui Diem accepted to return to Vietnam, and by then the war continued between the communist regime and the French. The war that we called it French Indochina War lasted from the end of 1946 until 1954. By this time, the French still controlled South Vietnam, and it was there that Bui Diem returned to form a new regime that called the State of Vietnam. But by 1954, the French suffered a big defeat at Dien Bien Phu, and the international situation was such that all the big country felt the need to convene an international conference to try to end the war in Vietnam. And so by then we had the Geneva Conference in 1954. Before 1954, in 1973, I served as a member of the government in Saigon under the regime of Emperor Bui Diem, now called it Chief of State and no more Emperor. The solution in terms of how to deal with the French, we negotiated with the French to try to get the full independence. The French promised independence to Bui Diem, but in practice they try to prolong their control of South Vietnam. And that is the reason why between 1953 and 1954 I had to participate in many negotiations with the French for trying to achieve the real independence on Vietnam, and not the kind of independence on Vietnam that was promised by the French then. And so it was at this time that happened the Geneva Conference in 1954. I went to France to begin to participate in the negotiations for independence of France, but independence of Vietnam with the French people. But in the same time, there was the negotiations in Geneva for peace in Vietnam. The Geneva Conference decided the partition of Vietnam into two parts. Above the 17 parallel, it belongs to the communist regime of North Vietnam, but south of the 17 parallel, it was the regime of Chief of State at Bui Diem. And so by then we came to the situation when in 1954 Bui Diem called on President Diem to form the new government after the Geneva Conference.
So before move on, I would like to ask you a question a little back from 1954, which was at the time Ho Chi Minh formed the Viet Minh Fund, and they using the propaganda by saying that everybody united under Viet Minh to fight with France to get independence for the country. And I believe that your party, your Nationalist Party, that did also join them. And later on, he told many of the National Party people to France or kill them. Do you have any memory or you know anything about that?
Oh, well, it was a very difficult period of time for all the Nationalist Party, because when the communists came to power, they tried to control everything. They did not accept the presence of the Nationalist Party. And so many of the members of the Nationalist Party, among themselves, many of my friends, students of the university in Hanoi, they were killed by the communists by then. And so the Vietnamese Nationalist Party were in a very awkward position, as I have mentioned it already. On one side, they would like to fight against the French, but on the other side, they knew very well that sooner or later they would be, well, completely destroyed by the communists. And that is the reason why they try to join the Bui Diem solution. In spite of the fact that they have a lot of reservation about the Bui Diem solution, the French promised independence, but in practice they try to prolong their control of the situation. And that is the situation in South Vietnam by 1953 and 1954.
You remember what's the principle for the Bui Diem solution?
Well, I think that the Nationalist Party, which supported the Bui Diem solution, they had no choice at all. They had to accept the solution, hoping that the French would really give back to Vietnam the independence they promised to Bui Diem. And that is the reason why through the years of 1952, 1953, 1954, we in the government in South Vietnam, we had to negotiate hard with the French. And the French gave up everything only after Dien Bien Phu in 1954.
So when you say that some of your friends, your party members were killed during the time, in the Ho Chi Minh, do you remember a few names? I believe some of your party leader also killed for their petty name. Tell two names.
Well, first of all, I have to mention the name of a very famous General Vo Nguyen Giap. In 1940, I was at the private school in Hanoi, Thăng Long, and Vo Nguyen Giap was a professor of history. I remember it very well. But he was a very special man, in the sense that when he taught us history, he taught us only about the French Revolution and Napoleon War. And so that is what I remember most during my years at the Thăng Long School in Hanoi, when I had Vo Nguyen Giáp, by then a young man, as a history professor. As far as those people in the Nationalist Party who were killed or who disappeared one way or the other under the communist rule, I have a lot of names. A lot of names because they are my friends at the university in Hanoi. So I can give the name of those people who were killed, and a very well-known name. The name of Mr. Dang Vu Chư, the son of Dr. Dang Vu Lạc, a member of the Nationalist Party, and the names of Dang Văn Bút, Dang Văn Nghiên, all of them students at the university in Hanoi. They are killed by the communists.
Okay.
Can you continue talking about the Geneva Convention in 1954?
Well, at the Geneva Conference, the communist regime in Hanoi, in practice, was the winner of the French. But under pressure from the international powers, they have to accept the solution proposed by the international power. It was the division of South Vietnam into two parts. The situation is somewhat like the situation in East Germany and West Germany, like the situation in North Korea and South Korea, because the international power by then think that it was perhaps the best solution for a situation by then. And so the communists in North Vietnam, under pressure from China and the Soviet Union, had to accept this situation. And South Vietnam by then had to accept the same situation, but perhaps a difference. The difference is that North Vietnam accepted temporarily the division of South Vietnam because they think that the communist regime will one day or another would occupy the whole Vietnam. While in South Vietnam, with a more somewhat beginning to be a liberal regime, we accepted the situation, hoping that sometime in the future it could be a reunification of the country, but a reunification through peaceful means, but not through war. The situation was quite clear. The North Vietnam did not accept the situation willingly. They had to accept it because the Chinese and the Soviet Union pressed them to accept the situation. But they dreamed of occupying the whole Vietnam, even through war, if necessary. While in South Vietnam, we accept the situation, hoping that one of these days, through peaceful means, that we can reunify the country exactly the way it had been done in the past in our history.
So that was the real reason for them to invade South Vietnam later on.
As I have mentioned, they had already prepared and the war against South Vietnam, and that is the reason why they left a lot of their people in South Vietnam, thinking that these people would form the fifth column for them in the future. And it was exactly this situation which developed later on in the years after, because those who were left in South Vietnam by the communist regime, they would develop it later on into a kind of rebellion against the government of Bui Diem.
So we heard that they signed a treaty and we don't sign it.
Yeah, we don't sign the Geneva Agreement.
And if anybody signed it, that person would be you, right?
Yes. But they claimed at the Geneva Conference there was an agreement according to which the troops of North Vietnam would withdraw to North Vietnam and the French troops would withdraw back to France. But in fact, they did not withdraw their troops from South Vietnam. And another clause of the Geneva Agreement was that it should be a kind of general election 2 years later. The communists later on took it as a motive, and they said that because there is no election in South Vietnam in '56, and that is the reason why we have to organize a kind of war against South Vietnam. But in fact, we did not sign the agreement at all. It was stipulated in the Geneva Agreement that it should be general election later. But South Vietnam, like the US, who was a member of those international powers to participate in the Geneva Agreement, they did not sign the agreement too.
So we go further to the historical, that after Mr. Diem came to the power to replace King Bao Dai, what will happen and how you involved into the Diem government?
Well, everybody at that time thought that Mr. Diem was a patriot. In fact, he was a real patriot, and he was an honest man too. But he had a very practical idea about how to rule the country. Perhaps an old-fashioned way of ruling the country from above. And that is the reason why later on he surrounded himself with his family and with a lot of people who agree with him. For those people who did not agree with him, they are pushed aside. And that is the reason why people said that Mr. Diem was somewhat a kind of dictator. He was not really a dictator, but as I have mentioned, he had a very special idea about how to rule the country, and that is the reason why it developed into a situation later on in 1963 when people felt the need to have something change, and something changed. It became the problem of 1963 when there was a Buddhist situation developing into rebellion against the regime of President Diem, and we had by then the coup against him and his regime in 1963, followed by a lot of other situations after '63. And I would say, and as I have mentioned in many of my books already, after '63 we had '64, and '64 was a kind of mess situation in South Vietnam. We had coup against coup, we had change of government, we have Buddhists against Catholics, we have students demonstration in the street, we have Northerners against Southerners, and that is the reason why by then the US government felt that they had to intervene. But if we want to come back to Mr. Diem, we have to say that the US was very much in favor of supporting President Diem. And during his years governing South Vietnam, Mr. Diem did bring a lot of good things for South Vietnam. He created an administration, he organized the whole country, He welcomed the 1 million of Vietnamese refugees from North Vietnam, leaving North Vietnam to come to South Vietnam. So a lot of things, but somehow in politics you have this situation developing into a kind of very difficult for him to handle. And that is the reason why, in spite of the support of the US, his regime succumbed to the coup against him in 1963. We have to mention too that during the whole period of President Diem in South Vietnam, the US began to committed themselves to South Vietnam already. In many of my books I mentioned that the US became first of all interested in Vietnam after 1945 because they sent a group of Americans helping the North Vietnamese in the border between North Vietnam and China by then. But it was only a beginning of interest. The beginning of interest developed into some kind of commitment. Commitment because the US helped the French in those Indochina War. A beginning of commitment already by then. But the commitment stopped when the French had asked for too much at Dien Bien Phu. The French asked for a global, a massive intervention to save them in Dien Bien Phu, and that is the reason why President Eisenhower refused to help the French by then. But so, and we came to 1954. And so in 1954, the US felt that it was very legitimate to help President Diem reorganizing South Vietnam by then. The support to President Diem lasted for many years, from 1954 to 1963. But when 1963 came with the Buddhist crisis in South Vietnam, the US seemed to get disenchanted with the Diem and the Diem regime, and that is the reason why people used to say that with or without the help of the American, the Vietnamese general could not organize the coup against Mr. Diem. But somehow, in my view, the situation in South Vietnam became a mess in 1954.
Can you tell us people said that, and also on all the paper from US side also recognize the involvement of the US side to the coup d'etat of Bui Diem. What is your opinion, sir?
Well, the situation in Vietnam was very serious by then because the Buddhist crisis was in full in the street of Saigon, and the government was very much in difficulty in controlling the situation. And that is the reason why the military group in South Vietnam felt that if they did not organize the coup, the communists would try to take advantage of the situation and organize a kind of open war against South Vietnam. In fact, by the time when we had the coup in 1963, there was a lot of fighting in the countryside between the troops of South Vietnam and the guerrilla left behind by the communist regime. And so on one side, on the political front, President Diem had difficulties to control the situation, and on the side, on the military part of the country, there are a lot of fightings going on, and that is the reason why, combined the political situation with the military situation, the military people in Vietnam felt it was necessary to organize the coup against President Diem. But as I have mentioned, without the help of the American or without the encouragement from the American, the Vietnamese general could do nothing.
From weekly and also from declassified paper lately, people mentioned about some CIA help to organize this coup d'etat, and they pay the generals and India, including Colonel at the time, Limantil, got paid to do that. Do you think that's right or wrong?
No, I do not think that the Vietnamese general were bribed for making the coup. Perhaps there's some kind of help here and there. But in general terms, the situation was such that, well, there is a combination of factors which push them to organize the coup, you see. And there are a lot of rumors and a lot of hearsay about these men accepting money from the American GOs or general, you see, having contacts with the American and so forth. A lot of things like that during a kind of confused situation like the one before the coup.
Later on, President Lyndon Johnson have some very strong comment about the people who did that coup d'etat in using like bastard or something like that.
Who?
President Johnson refer
yeah.
of South Vietnam. I mean about the general later become the leader as a bastard. Do you think as ambassador you hear anything like that?
No, well, there are a lot of hearsay about everything. If we listen to all these kind of hearsay or rumors, there are thousands and thousands of these things. Let us focus our attention on the main facts of history to try to describe the situation. These kind of hearsay perhaps are well, small talks, very interesting to listen to, but in terms of history, it doesn't deserve much attention.
Yeah, I would like you to have some word on this, since it's been spread out so much. So as an ambassador, you maybe know better than people have hearsay. So that's why I asked the question for you to kind of express your position. That's what the question, the reason for the question. Now I would like to once again focus back into the history.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
Well, first of all, in 1963, after the coup, as I have mentioned it already, it was a kind of messy situation in Saigon. I took advantage of this situation to travel to the US because I was very much impressed by, for instance, in the speech from John F. Kennedy when he came to power, the famous inaugural speech from John F. Kennedy, that I tried to have an opportunity to visit the US. And that is the reason why I made it my first trip to the US in 1954. I went to the US, I came to San Francisco to participate in the Republican convention through which Senator Goldwater was the Republican candidate. We have to mention that after the coup in Saigon in 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963. And President Johnson came to replace Kennedy by then. So it was 1964. And so in 1964, it was the beginning of the general election, re-election for Johnson. And that is the reason why I went to see the Republican convention in San Francisco, at which Senator Goldwater was chosen as a candidate on the side of the Republican against Johnson by then on the Democratic side, you see, on the Democrat side. I spent 2 months in the US, and it was the first time for me to look at the system, the American political system through which people got elected. But in the same time, it is a very, very special, because in August 1964, I had the opportunity to attend a session of the US Congress through which President Johnson asked for the authority to intervene military in South Vietnam, because one of the US ship in the Bay of the Gulf of Tonkin, was torpedoed by the communists. And it is a very, very, very special by then, because the Congress of the US by then adopted a resolution that was later called the Bay of Tonkin Resolution of 1964. I was very impressed by this session of the US Congress, because among the 100 senators, 98 from them voted for the resolution. And for the 35 members of the House, all of them voted for the resolution of what we call the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. So through this resolution, President Johnson had the authority to intervene military in South Vietnam. And that was the deepening of the US commitment to Vietnam after the sending of some 20,000 of advisors by President Kennedy by then, you see. So the problem is that from the initial interest through partial commitment, and it became later on with the Tonkin of Gulf of Tonkin resolution a full commitment. The full commitment in '64 became total massive commitment in 1965 with the landing of the Marines in Danang in March 1965.
So I would like to ask you a question about that. Part of the government of South Vietnam in 1965, did the U.S. government ask the permission to send troops over there or not, before they sent troops over there or not?
Again, I have to say that it was a very confused situation in terms of relation between the US and Vietnam at that time. I was at that time minister at the Prime Minister office for Prime Minister Phần. He came to power, becoming Prime Minister in February 1965. February 1965. And one early morning in March 1965, early morning, I was called by Dr. Quat, come to my home because we have urgent matters. And when I came to his home, I saw Mr. Manful, political counselor of the US Embassy in Saigon, over there already at Prime Minister Quat home. He said to me, Dr. Quat said to me, the Prime Minister, well, can you explain to me why in a sudden you have the landing of the Marines in Danang? He said to me that just a few days earlier, Ambassador Maxwell Taylor, General Maxwell Taylor, told me that perhaps we have to reinforce the defense of the airport of Danang, because from Danang the American planes flew north to North Vietnam in an operation bombing North Vietnam, and so we have to defend Danang, and that is the reason why we have to accept the landing of the Marine in Danang. Well, I would say that it was not totally a surprise, but a surprise in itself, because even Maxwell Taylor later on admitted that he opposes the landing of the Marine like that. In an official cable from Maxwell Taylor and Ambassador Johnson, the deputy ambassador by then, they sent back to the White House a cable telling that, well, they were not informed themselves about the landing of the Marine in Danang. So I just tried to describe the confusion by then between American establishment in Saigon and the military decision in Washington, and on the other side of the military embassy in Saigon, we have the government of South Vietnam. We knew nothing about it, you see. So the landing of the Marine in Danang in March 1965 was almost a complete surprise for everyone, including, I would say, the US Embassy in Saigon, because it was a decision taken from above, pushed by the military establishment in Washington, and Maxwell Taylor, the ambassador, as well as the deputy ambassador, they were not so totally informed about the exact nature of the landing of the Marine in Danang. It was only later on that they sent back some kind of, protest against it.
So, did your government respond to that decision, to that action of landing Marine in Vietnam soil without obtaining any sort of agreement, approval?
Well, we were in the situation such that the Vietnamese government could do nothing but to acknowledge this situation, because even the U.S. Embassy didn't know the whole thing, and how can the Vietnamese refuse the landing when it is a factor already? The landings were on the beach of Danang already, and they have to accept it, and we have to describe it as a kind of tacit acceptance from the South Vietnamese government. And the situation developed quickly in the next few months, up to the point that after the landing of the Marines in Danang, the U.S. military establishment in Washington sent more troops into South Vietnam by then. And so little by little, later on, it became a kind of massive involvement, up to almost 500,000 men in 1967.
So in your own opinion, do you think that's a good idea to bring a foreign force into your country, especially getting, don't have any prepare for the public opinion or any sort of preparing for the acceptance or the approval of Vietnam, Vietnamese?
Well, the Vietnamese government by then I was part of the government by then because I was the minister at the Prime Minister's office. We are fully aware of the very difficult situation, politically speaking, because the communists could very easily condemn us for accepting the presence of foreign troops in Vietnam. I have to mention right away that later on they accept the presence of the Chinese troops in North Vietnam, but nobody knows about it. The international opinion knew only about what we called the massive intervention of the US troops in South Vietnam, but they knew nothing about the intervention of the Chinese troops in North Vietnam too. And so, in the government, we are fully aware of the very awkward position in which we found ourselves, because that we had to accept the presence of foreign troops. While in North Vietnam, they claim that they have no foreign troops to help them by then. And so it was in this awkward position that later on we have to go on trying to defend ourselves. And I remember very well myself when in 1966 at the Manila Conference, personally I have to put in a clause of a communique according to which the US troops withdrew from South Vietnam immediately 6 months immediately after the end of the war, just to prove to the international opinion and to the international world that the Vietnamese government was not a puppet government and the Vietnamese government was a legitimate government asking the help of the American, but thinking always in terms of asking the American troops to leave South Vietnam as soon as peace comes.
So did the government, South Vietnamese government, did anything to tell the American that it's not right and we oppose that? Did Prime Minister Phan did anything in terms of telling the American that's not a good thing to do or anything?
Oh yes, we had very, very frank discussions with Ambassador Taylor and Ambassador Johnson. But the government of Dr. Quat lasted only just a few months. Yes, from February 1965 to June 1965, around 4 or 5 months. And after that came the government of the two generals, General Key and General Thieu, in June 1965. Well, by then we had already a massive presence of American troops in South Vietnam, what we call a de facto situation in South Vietnam already.
So we go further. In 1968, there was a Tet Offensive, and communists attacked many cities in the country. And we interviewed many South Vietnamese officers and soldiers, and they said that it was a surprise attack. And the situation in Hue was terrible because the North Vietnamese soldiers came into the city, infiltrated into the city, and have a list in their hand to hunt for people to kill, and the result was over 5,000 were killed, buried in a mass grave, and so on and so on. Can you tell us about how is that happened, and your opinion, and also what were you doing with, and then you have anything to do with in terms of talking to U.S. government, because I believe after that war, they decided to withdraw that war about Vietnam.
I have to mention right away that I was in the government in 1965, beginning February until June, but after Dr. Quat withdrew from the government, I was immediately after by General King to help in terms of what we call assistance for foreign aid.
But look like the war turned the other way and gone down from there. Can you explain?
Well, we just talked about the beginning of the massive involvement of the US in Vietnam through the landing of the Marines in Danang in 1965. From then on to the Tet attack of 1968, it was a period of 3 years, during which the situation in Vietnam, military speaking, was very much under control. And it was then that came the surprise attack of the communists throughout the country. Military speaking, it was a defeat of the North Vietnamese. A defeat that right now, even the North Vietnamese, in their history books, they have tacitly have to accept it, have to recognize it, that it was defeated. But politically and psychologically speaking, they did achieve a lot of success because the Tet attack had a very big influence on the US administration. This kind of big influence on the US administration, I had the chance to witness this change, the beginning of the change, the beginning of the mood in Washington by then. I was in Washington when the Tet attack began. Through a few weeks of stabilization of the situation, I want to come back to Saigon to brief the government in Saigon about the mood in Washington after the Tet attack. I met with a lot of American congressmen, senators, and journalists to try to feel the atmosphere. But I said to myself that if we come back to Vietnam, but, well, how about trying to see the US president? Without the US president, it is quite difficult to have a real good feeling of the situation. But it is not very easy to see the US president. Well, because normally an ambassador, when he came to Washington, well, perhaps one or twice every year we have a reception and we have a state dinner like that. So we have hundreds of ambassadors. So, well, there is no way to talk to the president by then. I tried my best. So I talked to a friend of mine in the White House who worked with John Rostow, Walt Rostow. Walt Rostow was the national security advisor to President Johnson. And I told Rostow that, well, please, I would like to see the president. I know that it is not a kind of normal request like that, but please try. I was not hopeful at all, but the next day the office of Rostow called me and said that come to my office and we'll see. So very late on the day, I came to the office of Walt Rostow. I sat with Rostow for a while, and after that, his deputy brought me to the Oval Office to see President Johnson. I have many opportunities to see President Johnson during the meeting in Honolulu, the meeting in Guam, and I saw a man very energetic and ebullient, talking, gesticulating, and everything like that. But by the time I saw in the White House, this day in March 1968, I saw a man very silent, putting his hands like that, and asked me, what is the situation in Vietnam? I tried to present to him the very optimistic picture of South Vietnam after the Tet attack of 1968. But I saw a different man from the man I quite often saw before. He was very silent, asking me just a few questions, and after that he confided to me, well, we are in a very dangerous situation because if we don't try our best, it is very difficult, you see. Listening to the man who was at the height of his power, President of the US, and at the same time leader of the free world, having to admit it, that we have difficulties in the war. It was quite an atmosphere for me. After almost an hour, I left the White House, very sad, going through the corridors of the empty corridors of the White House by then, because it was 6 or 7 o'clock in the afternoon. I rushed back to my office and put down in writing what President Johnson just told me, so not to forget the words of President Johnson himself. And that is the reason why I put it here in my calendar. President Johnson on 18th of March, he said to me, I cannot hold alone. We are in deep trouble if we don't win. That is exactly the words of President Johnson when he told me like that. It is like that in my calendar. I put it here on the 18th of March, 1968. So next day, after seeing President Johnson, I tried to see the new Defense Minister, Clark Clifford. I knew Clark Clifford before because he was a lawyer, international lawyer, talking in diplomatic terms always, you see, very, very polite man. But this day when I saw him, after I saw President Johnson, he was very brutal in his words with me, talking about the rumors about the difference between General K and General Thieu in Saigon. He said to me, we are fed up with the fight in Saigon. So, and in saying this, a few words he said to me, we are sick to death about the fight in Saigon. Our support to Vietnam is limited. We have to find a solution before we have to face a disaster. That is the exact word of Clark Clifford when I met him at that day. And I was not yet completely satisfied. I asked to see Secretary of State Dean Rusk by then. And when I saw Dean Rusk said to me, we have no choice right now. We cannot win a military war, but we have to seek an honorable peace. That is the words from Secretary of State Dean Rusk to me. So after seeing the three men, I rushed to reserve my plane to get back to Saigon right away. So I told the leader in Saigon that it is impossible for me not to see a beginning of change in Washington when I see President Johnson telling me in his own words that we have to win the war or we are in big difficulty, and one Clark Clifford in a very brutal term talked to me about the situation, and even Dean Ruskin when he talked about trying to find an honorable situation to the end of the war. How can you not to understand that there is a beginning of change in Washington by then? And so I conveyed to Saigon what I saw, what I listened after meeting with the three men at the White House and at the Defense Department and at the State Department in the same time. So that is the beginning, from my own point of view, the beginning of the disengagement of the U.S. from the war in Vietnam. How the U.S. is to get disengaged from South Vietnam, that is a problem for the next few months, because it was in '68. That is the beginning of the preparation of the election for the end of the year, because at the end of '68 it was the election, presidential election, at which President Johnson refused to be a candidate. So the beginning of the disengagement began with Johnson. But later on we will see that it would continue with Nixon when he came to power too.
So what went wrong? I thought we were winning in a way, and the offensive Tet battle. What went wrong? Why is that they changed from very much supported in 1965, 3 years later, and then we were winning?
Yes, the situation is very, very stabilized after the Tet attack. Already, he didn't say exactly this word, but the meaning was that we lost the war, and already it is time for the U.S. to withdraw from the whole thing. So, along with the kind of feeling from President Johnson that I saw from the meeting that when I saw him, I felt that, from my personal point of view, that there was the beginning of disengagement from the U.S., of the U.S. from the war in Vietnam. So when Nixon came to power, I tried to see right away Henry Kissinger. I saw him before because when he came to Saigon in 1965, when Ambassador Abbott Locho was there, I had invited him to my home for dinner. And along with many Vietnamese politicians, we had conversation with him. And we in South Vietnam, we were amazed to see a professor from the university in the U.S. so interested in the problem of Vietnam. And later on in November 1968, we saw an article from Henry Kissinger talking about the way to have negotiations already. He didn't say exactly in these words, but we felt right away that the man is talking about how to engage the North Vietnamese in some sort of talking sometime, somewhere, you see. And so that is the reason why immediately after the coming to power of the Nixon administration, I tried to see right away Dr. Henry Kissinger. Well, he was a very, very cordial with me because, well, I saw him before in Saigon. I invited him to my home. We had a very easy conversation in normal terms, you see. But sometimes I felt through the contact I had with the U.S. media, Bernie Kahn, Marvin Kahn, Joseph Kraft, because I had every day, almost every day of the week, a lunch with the journalist. I tried to understand the situation. And I felt that there is something like the beginning of the whole thing. And that is the reason why 1969 and the beginning of 1970, I wrote a long report to President Thieu, in which I put it in very, very clear terms here. I say that from my point of view, the US is going to stay in Vietnam for a period of 3 years, or if we can prolong this period, it would be a maximum of 5 years. That is in this kind of report that I sent back to President Thieu. I am very convinced that somehow the US is going to withdraw. It is only a matter of time, and it is a matter of how. But the US was definitely on the road to get out of South Vietnam, to get out of the war.
So I did interview a CIA, his name is James Parker. He wrote a book called Last Man Out, indicate that he was the last, U.S. service got out of Vietnam after Saigon fell. And I asked him that, did you regret what, and then you want to do something that you didn't do? And then he told me that, well, I failed to come to meet Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, and look at his eyes and said, we are winning the war. This war is winnable, and then don't listen to word of contact. And my question to you, what would you tell President Johnson, on the meeting that you just said that he changed and he looked like very, very sad and very worried about the war. What did you tell him? Did you tell him that we're winning?
Yes, but we have to mention, and I failed to mention this problem up to now. That is a problem of the public opinion in the US by then. You remember, and a lot of news media men, they know about the anti-war demonstrations in the US. Sometimes they demonstrated against the war in front of the Vietnamese embassy. Sometimes they demonstrated at the Pentagon. And the public opinion in the US was against the war. That is quite natural, very natural from my point of view, because the soldiers from the US Army were soldiers that they had to go to war. And the mother of those soldiers, they are concerned about their son going to war. It is not yet a kind of an army of volunteers, but it was an army of conscripts, you see. So the mother of the soldiers were concerned about their son. And the public opinion in the same time very much influenced by the journalists like Walter Cronkite, who reported about the war, about the bad side of the war, you see. So the whole US public opinion, through the demonstration in the street and through the kind of opinion from the mothers of the soldiers, American soldiers who fought in Vietnam, it went up to a point that President Johnson could not ignore the public opinion. And that is the reason why he was so disappointed by the result of the Tet attack, in spite of the fact that it was a military victory for our side. It was a military victory but it was defeated in terms of political and in terms of psychological situation that was influenced by the public opinion very much against the war. This kind of situation in the US after the Johnson administration continued with the Nixon administration. And that is the reason why the Nixon administration tried to adopt a new policy that they call later on Vietnamization of the war. Vietnamization of the war because they transfer to the Vietnamese the responsibility of waging the war against the North. The Vietnamese Vietnamization policy was widely accepted by the Vietnamese because we said by then that we had the responsibility to do the war ourselves, and the American can withdraw, but we hope that they can continue to help us. And that is the situation which later on, when the US withdrew completely from South Vietnam after the conclusion of the Paris Agreement in 1973, that the Vietnamese had to do the war by themselves. But unfortunately, they had to do the war by themselves without the help from the Americans in the end. And that is the reason why they did not succeed in defending South Vietnam against the invasion from the North in 1975.
So we were talking about the public opinion didn't support the war, and that's why the war turned that way. But people also said that at that time American interest was also shift into Middle East. That's why they're talking about Henry Kissinger going to China for negotiation. So can you explain?
Well, I did mention to you earlier the resolution from the US Congress, we call it the Tonkin Gong Resolution in 1964. So it is only a matter of few years between August 64 and March 1968. So the situation in the West was from supporting the war in Vietnam, supporting the US intervention. And it was a support that accepted by the almost totally number of the total number of the US senators by then, and the total number of US congressmen by then. It means that almost the total absolute majority of the US Congress for supporting the war. And it became later on, a few years later, the beginning of the disengagement from the policy of supporting South Vietnam. We talked about the coming to power of the Nixon administration, and with the US foreign policy in the hands of Dr. Henry Kissinger. So we talked about the beginning of what we call the Vietnamization of the war in Vietnam. Vietnamization means a gradual transfer of responsibility from the US Army to the South Vietnamese Army. And it was quite a successful policy. But in the same time, we have to recognize the fact that even if it was a success of American policy, the Vietnamization of the war, the US had to withdraw anyway. And that is the reason why the Nixon administration, on one side, helping the South Vietnamese to fight the war themselves, and in the same time trying to find a way through diplomatic channel to find the war, to end the war too. And that is the situation of in South Vietnam, under control with the Vietnamization policy on one side, and on the other side, the US administration under Nixon and Kissinger trying to help South Vietnam, but in the same time trying to find ways through diplomatic channel to have a conclusion of the war. We can say that from 1970 to the situation was quite good in South Vietnam, because in 1972 the communists organized a big offensive. We call it mùa hè đỏ lửa, the fiery summer of 1972. The attack at Quang Tri, the attack at Hue, the attack in some other part of the South Vietnamese territory too, but everywhere they failed. And it demonstrated quite the success of the Vietnamization policy, in spite of the fact that the South Vietnamese army was quite extended a period after 70 and culminating with the 72, but without success in 72, but continuing with the negotiations in Paris through Henry Kissinger and the team in Paris. In 1968, I was ambassador in the US. But by then, there was the beginning of the talks in Paris. Somehow, I don't know why, the Vietnamese government felt it necessary for me to accumulate the responsibility in Washington and the responsibility in Paris. So every week I had to make the shuttle between Washington and Paris. On Monday I took the plane from Washington, I arrived early morning in Paris. On Tuesday I stayed in Paris until Thursday. I returned to Washington for the weekend to do my job in Washington and return to Paris the next Monday. The next job in Paris.
And you continue to talk about Paris negotiation.
Well, I just mentioned that the US began the negotiation with the communist side from May 1968 to the end of 1972, and the conclusion of the agreement in Paris was in January 73. But it is very, very interesting to describe the negotiations in Paris from the beginning to the end. We called it negotiation, but at the beginning it was not negotiation at all. The two sides got together at the Majestic Hotel. And they have their speech, the Americans have their speech too. And so it continued after a kind of completely useless conversation from the two sides that there was no meaning at all to the kind of what we call not negotiation, but we call conversation, not even conversation. We call it talking more than conversation or negotiation. I was on the outside because at the beginning it was between the Americans and the North Vietnamese. But at the end of 1968, the Americans suggest that, well, we have to have on our side that the South Vietnamese government, because the other side, they would like to have on their side the National Front of Liberation. And by then there was discussions about what kind of flags did you bring over there, what kind of table, round table or square table or rectangular table. Nobody agreed about it, up to the point that later on we agree on the four sides. The two sides on their side and the two sides on our side. And it is with this kind of situation that we, on our side, we began the conversation with the other side. It lasts for 2 years, like that. Every week or every 2 weeks they come to the Majestic Hotel, they talk their way, we talk our way, and we come to no result at all. But we did not know by then that Henry Kissinger already tried to have private and secret contacts with the other side. We knew it only later on in 1971. This kind of conversation between Henry Kissinger and the North Vietnamese, we didn't know about it. But myself, in contact with the international press, I had the kind of feeling that something going on without our knowing it. Once I asked Dr. Kissinger, well, I heard the rumors that, well, there is something going on. He didn't answer my question at all. He said that, well, everything we do, your president knows about it too. And immediately after getting along with Kissinger, I flashed back to Saigon in secret cable to President Thieu. I said that today I met with Henry Kissinger and I asked him if they're going on, and he said that your president knows everything about it. So I have to inform you about this conversation. So if there is a real conversation between the American side and you should know about it. You can think that this is not up to me to know about it, that is okay. But you should know that there is something. Isn't Ambassador Bunker telling you everything about it? I don't know, that is your problem, but I have to inform you that I have conversation with Henry Kissinger, I asked him about it, and he said that you know everything about it. So you see that it is a kind of very, very tricky situation that I found myself when I had to deal with this problem of getting in touch with Kissinger, guessing that there is something going on, but not knowing exactly what was going on. It was only in 1971 that it became public that Kissinger had private contacts with the other side. Now, the private contacts between Kissinger and Le Duc Tho and Xuân Thuy lasted for almost a year, until October 72, when Kissinger came to Saigon and presented to Thieu a draft of what they called an agreement between the other side, between North Vietnam and the Americans, between Le Duc Tho and Henry Kissinger. The South Vietnamese government and President Tho and President Thieu was very, very unhappy with the draft agreement because they didn't know about it. They didn't know about it because later on, when I asked Hoàng Đức Nhã whether President Thieu knew everything about the private talks, Hoàng Đức Nhã said to me that Ambassador Bunker from time to time came to see President Thieu and briefly, well, in general terms about the situation going on. But I am not sure that President Thieu knows everything about how the terms of the Paris Agreement was negotiated until the time when Henry Kissinger came to Saigon and presented to him the draft of the agreement. The draft of the agreement was very, very in favor of North Vietnam. First of all, when he asked about a Vietnamese text of the agreement, there was no Vietnamese text at all. And when we asked about some clarification of the clause in the agreement, there is no clarification at all. And that is the reason why when Kissinger thought that he could get right away the agreement from President Thieu about the draft agreement, instead of it, he had some kind of rebuttal from President Thieu. He planned apparently to go to Saigon and after that to go to Hanoi. But he didn't get the approval of Thieu, so he had to get back to Washington. And it was at that time that he organized the press conference when he said that peace was at hand. That is a very famous press conference at which he said that peace is at hand. Now, Saigon was very unhappy with the draft agreement. By then I returned to Saigon already. I was a former ambassador and no more ambassador. But somehow President Thieu had some kind of idea about me. I did not understand why, but he asked to see me and he said to me, please help me. Go to Washington. It is too late right now. But you have to go to Washington to fight for something better than the draft agreement. And so that is the reason why I accepted to go to Washington again as a former ambassador. Not yet ambassador at large, because later on, a few months later, he found it more practical to appoint me as ambassador at large. But by the time I went to Washington about the draft agreement, I was the former ambassador. I saw Henry Kissinger, and I asked President Thieu to have with me former Foreign Minister Trần Văn Đô. Foreign Minister Trần Văn Đô was negotiating the agreement in Geneva in 1954. He was well known in Vietnam. So I asked President Thieu, please let me have a former foreign minister along with me in my mission right now. So both of us, former foreign minister, Doe and myself, we went to see Kissinger. We talked about a very, very important point. And the very important point was the presence of the North Vietnamese troops in South Vietnam. The draft agreement did mention this problem. It is tacitly accepted that the North Vietnamese troops could stay in South Vietnam. But immediately after that, Dr. Kissinger returned to Paris. I follow him to Paris because I think that I have to follow him to see what's going on over there. And again he said to me that the foreign U.S. policy, the U.S. foreign policy depends on the conclusion of the Paris Agreement. And so I will try to do my best. But I don't think that I can have improvement concerning the clause about the presence of the North Vietnamese troops in South Vietnam. But apart from it, if your president is not going to sign the Paris Agreement, it will be the end of the aid to South Vietnam. The future of the U.S. foreign policy depends on the conclusion of the Paris Agreement, and it is up to you to sign or not to sign the Paris Agreement. But if you don't sign the Paris Agreement, it will be the end of Vietnam, aid to Vietnam. And this is the word from Henry Kissinger. You see.
So, President did sign?
He paragraphed the Paris Agreement on 23rd of January, and it was later on signed by Secretary of State William Rogers. But in his capacity of National Security Advisor from President Nixon, he simply paraphrased the agreement. President Thieu sent to me a telegram at this time, because in the meantime he had exchanged very brutal words from President Nixon to President Thieu. Brutal words, you see, we have the text here. President Thieu asked me to give him a final report about the Paris Agreement. He said to me, don't send me cable anymore, because we know that the cable are somewhat, well, very, very easily led by the American Secret Service, you see. I am going to send you a man who will arrive in Paris the next day, and he will bring back to me your report. So I stayed overnight, and I wrote a report of 23 pages to send back to him, telling him the whole truth about it, and telling him finally that it is the moment of truth, exactly the way Haig and Kissinger told me, the hour of truth. It is up to us to accept or not to accept the Paris Agreement. And I told him, if we accept, what could be the situation? If we do not accept, what could be the situation? And we made the middle choice, not accepting but not signing anything at all. What could be the consequence of it? So that is a kind of report in 23 pages that I sent back to President Thieu on this day before Kissinger put down his signature on the draft agreement by then. But it was the end, almost the end of South Vietnam by then. President Thieu couldn't do nothing at all. but it is a kind of de facto situation he had to accept, and he sent the foreign minister of South Vietnam to sign the Paris Agreement. Fortunately, there is a little bit of hope after that. We don't hope in the sense that long before President Thieu tried to see President Nixon in the U.S., but the U.S. administration tried to avoid it somehow, you see, for one reason or another, you see. They avoid the kind of visit that Thieu could make to the U.S. But after the Paris Agreement, Nixon promised to Thieu that, well, we are going to see him, and so they invited Thieu to San Clemente in April 1973. I returned to Vietnam along with Thieu after the Paris Agreement signed, and in April '73, President Thieu accepted the invitation from President Nixon to go to San Clemente. To San Clemente, but not to Washington. And that is a kind of difference of that, a kind of nuances. Going to San Clemente is different from going to Washington. But anyway, President Thieu accepted. And he asked me again to accompany him to San Clemente. And at the San Clemente, it was quite a good meeting, because President Nixon promised to help South Vietnam, even to confirm that the U.S. would retaliate if there is a kind of violation of the agreement by the North Vietnamese. Up to a point that in the conversation between us outside the corridor, the Americans said that we will bomb them out. That is exactly the word of the American telling me. We will bomb them out. It means that if there is a violation of the agreement. So we came back after the San Clemente meeting. Mr. Thieu quite satisfied with the promise of Mr. Nixon to help South Vietnam, even in case of violation of the agreement. But just a few months later, not a few months, but a few weeks later, came to the U.S. the problem of the Watergate. And General Haig, who was scheduled to go to Vietnam, had to cancel his trip to South Vietnam. And by then, the whole U.S. administration was involved in the Watergate affair, and nobody talks about Vietnam anymore, until 1975, when the communists attacked in Ban My Thuột, and when, again, but this time as ambassador at large, I returned to the U.S. to lobby for the emergency help of 700 million. I didn't succeed at all, because the Congress refused to approve the aid, and I have to return empty just 10 days before the final days of South Vietnam. And that is the end of history by then for South Vietnam.
So you were dealing a lot with Kissinger from beginning to end. What kind of people, person, anything, Kissinger?
Well, he is a very brilliant man, very intelligent man, but his way of operating with all of us in South Vietnam is not the kind of openness a kind of frankness that we expected from a big nation dealing with a small nation like ours. We put our hope in the Americans, but somehow it was a kind of manipulation, diplomatic manipulation from Henry Kissinger. He didn't tell the truth to President Thieu until the last minute. He didn't tell to me at all about what was going on. And the South Vietnamese were put in a very, very dangerous, awkward situation of having to accept a very bad agreement, or if not, accept the end of South Vietnam exactly the way Henry Kissinger and General Haig put it to me, you see. So I think that it is a very, very bad way of dealing with a small ally like South Vietnam. And it is a very, very crucial lesson for the South Vietnamese to learn about how to deal with a big nation. And I do think that all the small nations around the world have to learn from the Vietnamese lesson too, not including the Americans themselves. They have to learn from the lesson of Vietnam, because the problem of intervention in Vietnam happened in the 60s and the 70s, but right now they have to deal with the same problem of intervention. The kind of situation that we have to accept the help of the American, but we sincerely hope that the American, with their tradition of freedom and liberty, would withdraw from South Vietnam. I remember that once in Paris, just at the anniversary of the Paris Agreement in 2003, in a conference organized by the French Foreign Ministry, I said to the audience by then that you talked about the American presence in South Vietnam. Well, we cannot deny it, because there was half a million men of US troops in South Vietnam. But in the same time, nobody can deny that the Americans did intervene in South Vietnam only very late, and that they didn't have any territorial ambition like the French in South Vietnam. I said in an audience like that. And I mentioned that by the time the Americans were in South Vietnam, there were also almost hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops in North Vietnam. Why don't you talk about the presence of the Chinese troops in North Vietnam? You see? So talking about the Vietnamese being the puppet of the American, I would say that it is a kind of insult to the South Vietnamese.
So what do you think about Ho Chi Minh? Because also in textbook, American textbook, they said Ho Chi Minh was the father of country of Vietnam, who brought independence, freedom and happiness to the people.
Yeah. Well, you know that for a time in the leftist circle in Europe, they said that Ho Chi Minh can be a Tito in Asia. But the reality was quite blunted later on, and everybody knows that Ho Chi Minh tried to use the platform of fighting for the independence of Vietnam but in the same time himself and his successors tried to impose the kind of Stalinist, Maoist regime into the whole country. And it is a situation the way right now. In China you have the same regime. They develop the economy, but they control politics. And in South Vietnam we have the same situation, a beginning of development in economic terms, but in the same time a very strict control of the political situation, up to the point that they have the monopoly of the political situation over the whole country.
So my last question, how do you settle yourself and your family in the United States?
What?
How you settle yourself and your family in the United States?
I would say that in spite of the contradiction of U.S. foreign policy, which somehow became the causes of the disastrous ending of South Vietnam in '75. In spite of these contradiction, we South Vietnamese, we cannot forget the way South Vietnamese were treated around the end of the war by the U.S. administration and in the same time by the U.S. Congress, who refused to add the South Vietnam. I read the other day an article from an American journalist who said that the Vietnamese didn't fight at all. They have all the ammunition, the modern equipment that they need to fight the war. I would say that it is a lie, because everybody, all the American knows that around the months at the end of the war, there was no fuel for Vietnamese plane to fly. There is no ammunition for the Vietnamese to fight on the front line. It was a complete lack of ammunition that the Vietnamese had to suffer the defeat in '75. While in '72, the way I mentioned to you earlier, they fought well against the North Vietnamese in pushing the North Vietnamese back to the frontier, in reoccupying Quang Tri, in reoccupying Hue, in getting back to Xuân Lộc. All this kind of fighting. We had the ammunition by then, and we had the support of the American plane by then. But later on, even the small amount of 700 million was refused. By then I talked to the American legislator. I said that from '72 we didn't ask for American blood anymore. We asked simply for American aid, American military aid and American economic aid. So we fought it ourselves, but you refused to help us at the end. I wrote in my book that it is not the finest hour in the American history when the U.S. Congress refused to accept the aid of 700 million for the South Vietnamese. But in spite of that, getting back to your question, I would say that we do not forget it, but at the same time, we have to see that hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese, thanks to the generosity of the American people. So the South Vietnamese were accepted right now on the American soil. And it is a very, very good situation for all of them. And they have to thank the American because they grow up with the new generation of Vietnamese American right now doing very well in the American society. So it is a kind of mixed feeling that I am telling my fellow Vietnamese. We have to thank the American for having accepted so many Vietnamese right now on the soil of America, exactly the way you try to present the history of the Vietnamese community in the US right now. But history is a history. If we don't forget the history, well, it would be for us to remember, and for the American to remember too. But the present situation is different. We have almost more than 1 million of Vietnamese right now in the US. Our children right now live in freedom, they prosper. They are citizens of the new country. They are proud citizens of the new country, and it is thanks to the generosity of the American people, and we have to recognize this fact, in spite of the fact that history is a history.
Will you come back to Vietnam if the communists no longer there?
Yes, by the day when there is no more communist government in South Vietnam, I would be very happy to come back to South Vietnam, as you say, but not now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Share your...
Well, when you mentioned to me that you are trying to make a film for the benefits of the young generation of Vietnamese, I accepted willingly because I think that the new generation of Vietnamese, we call it Vietnamese American right now. They go to the American school, American universities, and most of the time they go through American books or American TV program. And most of the time it is a kind of view from the American view, and we cannot blame it for being somewhat biased in favor of their views, you see. So what you are doing right now is quite useful from my point of view, in the sense that it will help the South Vietnamese, the Vietnamese American to understand why they are in this country right now, and why later on in their future they can have Vietnam to develop it into a free and prosperous country again. That is my hope.